In this video, we're going to talk about the impairment of debt investments. So we've talked about impairment before in Intermediate 1, but we applied it to fixed and intangible assets. Of course, we could also have certain circumstances trigger such that the value of my debt investments are considered not just temporarily beneath the carrying value or amortized cost, but they are other than temporarily impaired. And this is shorthanded in accounting parlance, UTTI, so other than temporarily impaired. And that's a pretty big distinction because really anytime we have an unrealized loss on an AFS security, they are impaired. They are impaired beneath their carrying value. However, for us to actually apply a process of impairment, we have to have some reason to believe that the value will not be recovered or is due to something called, or is due to a credit loss, sorry. That should be due to a credit loss, not due to a non-credit loss. So some important facts, just right off the bat: trading securities do not require impairment. They are already having their unrealized losses flow through net income. So they are already in a process of impairment because their unrealized gains and losses already flow through net income. So we don't need to adjust them in any particular way due to impairing items because we'll just go ahead and take those through net income already. Now, available for sale on HTM securities may need to be impaired. Even though we don't mark HTM to market, we can determine that their amortized cost may not be recoverable and apply impairment in order to recognize that fact. So just some definitions. Impaired in the context of investment simply means that we have a fair market value that is less than the carrying value. And so in that circumstance, or under that idea, any of them that have a credit balance, remember this is an unrealized loss balance, any of them that have a credit balance in the security fair value adjustment account are in name impaired. We just don't need to actually do any of these more complicated processes unless we believe that we are not going to be able to get out of this situation prior to selling. That's when something is other than temporarily impaired. And it occurs when we meet a certain criterion that we're going to talk about below in this list of the OTT impairment process. But we have to have some sort of criteria recognized prior to recognizing this amount as OTTI, other than temporarily impaired. So remember, the lot of securities are impaired. It's just a matter of whether we believe we're going to be able to bounce back from that loss or whether that's just not something that's going to be in the cards for our portfolio securities or for our particular securities. A credit loss, now this is also a very important distinction, as you can see when I had it correct up here. A credit loss is a circumstance under which the investor believes it's not going to recover the cash flows of the investment. The cash flows of the investment are the amortized cost, because remember, the amortized cost is just the present value of the investment at any point in time at the original market rate of interest when it was issued, when it was purchased. So if that amortized cost is the present value at any point in time, those are the present value of the cash flows we expect to receive. Now, if we're not going to be paid those, that means that perhaps the person whose debt we bought is no longer able to make those payments. Then we have a credit loss situation because the credit worthiness of the counterparty has been called into question. Now, non-credit losses, this is kind of what we've been studying up to this point. These are fluctuations in interest rates, fluctuations in macroeconomic factors, but not due or a factor of the counterparty in our transaction. So these are just the normal credit loss. These are just the normal losses that we've been recording up to this point. A credit loss is a little bit more special. If we have a credit loss, we are definitely going to record an impairment of some sort. So in order to judge for impairment, remember, everything has a different sort of impairment process. Investments are no different. First, we have to know, is the investment impaired? So the debt investment has to have a market value that is beneath the amortized cost. So we have to be in that unrealized loss position, as I said earlier. And note, again, just because we have a credit position in our security fair value adjustment balance doesn't mean that we have to apply the process of impairment, because now we have to determine, is it other than temporary? If it's not other than temporary, we're going to get it back. We don't have to worry about recording impairment. So is the impairment OTT? Now, this is that list. I said one of the list of 3 things has to be true in order for us to recognize an impairment process. It's OTTI if any one of these. The investor intends on selling the investment. So if we're in an unrealized loss balance and the person's intending on selling it, say in 6 months from the date, then we need to go ahead and recognize impairment. We're recognizing the loss, the fact that they're in a loss position, they're intending on selling it. So all we're doing is accelerating that loss. And this might be somewhat familiar or taste a little familiar. It should, I hope, because this is a little bit of that conservatism that is guiding us to recognize a loss ahead of the sale. So, similar to marking our inventories down to market value before we recognize them in a sale, similar to impairing a discontinued operation prior to the sale, right? So this, again, is us marking this item down in advance of the idea of selling it because we intend on selling it. Now, 2 is pretty much related. The investor believes that it's more likely than not. So 50%, it's above 50% likelihood that it will be required to sell the investment prior to recovering the loss position. So we are not going to be able to get that. Therefore, we need to go ahead and recognize the impairment. Again, this is an instance of being required to sell it or thinking we're going to have to sell it, and hence needing to recognize that conservative loss ahead of time prior to the sale. And then the final item is the investor determines there is a credit loss that exists. So remember, the credit loss is due to some expectation that we're not going to get the cash flows we thought we were going to get. And again, this has to deal with the counterparty's ability to pay. So we won't expect to get all that principal perhaps, or we don't expect to get all those payments because the person whose debt we're holding is no longer credit worthy, right? That's what a credit loss is. Finally, after we've decided, all right, it's triggered one of those, remember, just one, and then we have to decide based on which one it triggered, how to record it. So we're going to record the OTT impairment on the balance sheet. It's going to be impaired to its fair value, it's going to be represented at its impaired value. And that's true no matter what. So that under any of those 3 criterion, it's always going to go down to the impaired value. Number 2, though, how we're going to record that change in the balance sheet is going to either flow through net income or OCI, depending on the reason. So remember that recording the balance sheet at fair value is not a change for AFS, but HTM now gets marked to value under an impairment. We record the change in net income if it's OTT for 2 Roman numeral 1 or 2 Roman numeral 2. So we're going to put it into net income if it's for reason Roman numeral 1 or 2. And that's because under these conditions, remember, it was all about whether or not we would have to sell it. So it's either the selling it outright because we intend on selling it as the investor, or the likelihood of selling it. And so if we're going to sell it, or the likelihood of us selling it is above 50%, then we're just going to go ahead and recognize that loss in net income because we're selling it. And remember, whenever we sell any of these securities, it goes through net income. So that's the best way to remember that. The first two conditions are based on either the intent to sell or the probability that you're going to have to sell before it gets out of a loss position. And when those are triggered, because we record sales and realized sales in net income, those two conditions make us record the impairment in net income. If the other than temporary designation is due to the final reason, that Roman numeral 3, remember that just has to deal with credit losses, then we're going to recognize just the credit loss portion through net income, and any remaining amounts go through OCI. Remember, I was telling you that that non-credit loss portion is just what we've been doing all along up to now. It has to do with market fluctuations, macroeconomic factors. So just like it's gone, just as we've treated it up to this point, we take it through OCI. Now, the new kind of loss that we've been talking about in this impairment module is a credit loss. And remember, that's about the counterparty. And if the counterparty is now not creditworthy, we then go ahead and process that piece through net income. So let's go ahead and go through this example. And I've been, accused of going through easy examples, so I wanted to make sure that this example was not that easy. But this demonstrates some familiarity with time value of money concepts, familiarity with how to adjust securities when they're available for sale or when we're marketing them to market. It has a lot of pieces. And again, we're starting to get to that part in our topics where, hopefully you've got the fundamentals down, because now we're adding on to it layer by layer. So here we got Froning Corp investing in the bonds of Fraser Corp on January 1st, 2018. They paid $950,872.90 for some bonds that had a $1.2 million face value and pay 6% stated interest, and they're maturing in 15 years. Now notice what I didn't give you here was the market rate. I gave you what they were purchased for, which is, think about it for a second. What is that? I would have purchased something that's going to pay me $1.2 million and 6% stated interest. Therefore, this has to be the present value of those promises. The 1.2, of course, is the fair value. The 6% stated gives me the payments when I apply it to the $1.2 million fair value. I'm sorry, it's fair value, face value. So that's my payment right there, $72,000, and they mature in 15 years, and that's my end. So I dug out some information, and again, testing your ability to work with those present values. Froning Corp determined that on December 31st, 2020, that the bonds had a market interest rate equivalent to 10%. So here I do give you the market interest rate, but that's for 12/31/20. But they valued them at $850 after considering the probability of credit losses. On January 1st, 2020, the security fair value adjustment account held a $96,000 credit balance. This impairment was deemed temporary at the time. So remember, like I said, whenever we have a credit balance, it's an impaired position, but as long as it's only temporary, we don't have to do any sort of fancy accounting. Anyway, so there's a lot of information here. We're going to take it a step at a time. The first thing we need to figure out is, what is the carrying value of the bonds on 12/31/20? Well, in order to get that, remember, the carrying value is always based on the interest rate, the market, I should specify, the market interest rate at investment. So we need that, because I didn't give that to you. I gave you a present value of $950,872.90. Very specific, because I had a very specific rate to solve for that when I was creating the problem. Face value is $1.2 million. And the payment we calculated to be $72 million. Sorry, 72,000, not million. And then the N is 15. So if you punch that into your calculator, remember, this is an outflow of cash, so that would actually be a negative number. The face value and the payment are going to be positive numbers because those represent inflows of cash. Now, after you do the calculations, if you do them correctly, you'll find that the interest rate at investment was 8.5%. But that only solves, of course, for what was going on when we invested on 1/1/18. If we're going to now peel this forward, we take that piece and we say, all right, we know that the face value is the same, 1,200,000. We know that the payment is the same, 72,000. We know that our I now is 8.5%. But in order to get that carrying value without taking it through all those iterations, I'm solving this when n equals 12. Because remember, in order to find the carrying value at any point in time, we just have to adjust our n. December 31st, 2020 is 3 years from the date of 1/1/18. Don't screw up like my intermediate one students are doing right now, where they would say, oh, but wait, that's only 2 years, but then they forgot to count all of 2018. So remember, all of 2018, all of 2019, all of 2020, because we're at 12/31/20, that gives me 3 years, right? 3 years elapsed between 1/1/18 and 12/31/20. So now that gives me my new present value calculation. That new present value is the carrying value of the investment at that date. And if you plug that into your calculator, you'll find that it's 979, 659, and 42 cents. You wouldn't have to carry it out to 42 cents. I just tend to do it on these problems with the interest rate sensitivity and people getting really kind of flustered with all that. But I wouldn't dock you for it if you just gave me the dollars. So now determine the market value of bonds on 12/31/20. So remember, the market value is going to be driven by the value of I on the day we're talking about. So I told you that the market rate of interest was 10% on that day. Remember, this 8.5 is what the market rate of interest was on January 1st, 2018. It gets locked in terms of our carrying value on the books. But if we're talking about market value, it's always moving. It's always creating those non-credit gains and losses. So we would set I to 10%, but use everything else from this formula except for that I, because n is 12 correlates to that. So we would have I to 10%, n equals 12. I'll just write it out just to make sure you know exactly what we're talking about, because none of this stuff changes. The only thing that changes is the I at which we're assessing these, and then we solve for a present value. That gives me the market value. That present value gives me $872,942.79. Okay, so now I got the market value, I have the carrying value. The next step really would be to determine, well, what's a non-credit loss? What's the credit loss portion? Because I told you that Froning has valued them at $850,000 after determining the probability of credit losses. So, it helps to kind of think of this in terms of a spectrum of what's going on here. We have the amortized cost, or the carrying value at this time. And that was 979, 659, 42. We have also here the market value. This is what we determined in 2, 872, 942, 79. And then we had the value after we consider credit losses. So that was 850. So if this is the value after credit loss assessments, then really, we could we could break this up then as, well, this portion here is going to be my credit loss. This portion here is my non-credit loss. So the credit loss portion comes out to $22,942.79. And the non-credit loss portion comes out to $106,716.63. So we are in, if we think about the entire difference, right, we're in a almost $130,000 deficit. However, we can break this up between, well, what is the market force and what is just on the client that we're dealing with? And that's going to be integral, remember, to deciding where to put that loss and how to partition it if it falls under certain circumstances. So now I say, well, suppose we have two scenarios going on here. Suppose in scenario one, it is likely that Froning will sell, or it is more likely than not that it'll sell prior to resolving the credit losses on those securities. Well, remember, if that's the case, if we have this sort of buzzword that we have to sell, or we're more likely than not to sell, then that's going to trigger saying, all right, put everything through net income. Because if we are going to sell it, it's going to be a realized gain or loss. That goes through net income. Therefore, we got to impair this puppy and put it through net income. Now, if Froning assesses that it will not sell, and it is not more likely than not that it'll sell, but still determines there's a credit loss, this is when we have the credit loss going to net income and the non-credit loss going to OCI. So we have that split between the two. It's either going to go all to net income or split between OCI and NI. So now we're going to do both scenarios. We're going to look at the journal entries under both scenarios in order to make this happen. So under scenario one, the total loss is going to be recognized through net income. So we would have an impairment loss through net income, and that would be equal to the entire deficit from carrying value on the books to the estimated value after credit losses. So this has both credit and non-credit losses in it. And we're going to credit in order to bring that investment down, because remember, we have to bring its balance sheet value down. We're going to have to credit a loss on investment. So what does this do? Think about it for a bit. If we're crediting a contra asset, we're increasing it. So we're increasing a contra asset, which brings down my asset's value, and this is going to go through net income as a loss. Now, also remember that when we recognize this loss, we're recognizing both the credit and the non-credit portions into net income. So it's, in a sense, already recycling some of what has happened in OCI. So what would really need to happen is for the security fair value adjustment, we'll just, simplify the complicated at this point and say, all right, well, I remember the problem said it did have a $96,000 credit balance here, but since we've basically taken this $96,000 and put it through net income, because we're realizing, remember, both the credit and the non-credit losses here, this is now zeroed out because we need to get out. We've recognized it in net income. We'd be double counting it if it stayed in our OCI. And so the second thing would involve backing this out with a debit to the security fair value adjustment account and a credit to unrealized. And here, this is where you could say you could credit a loss or you could credit a gain. Doesn't really matter. An unrealized, I'll put it in quotes, gain, and that's going to OCI. So this correctly brings out that fair value adjustment and puts all of that negativity, all of that downward movement from the asset into the discount account. Correctly, it correctly impairs the investment and adjusts OCI such that, remember, this $96,000 loss was in my AOCI when it got closed out, and that can't be in there anymore because it's heading to net income, right? It's actually in this number now, and it's going to net income, so we need to take it out of OCI. Now, it's going to take a while to think about. You should understand that sort of, that, be proficient to understand those movements, though, and try to work to that point if you're not already. And remember, this is the $96,000 change that I'm actually journalizing here that triggers the OCI gain. And again, you really need to get that, because if you're not getting that piece, you're going to be lost. Not just in these topics, but in quite a few others. Scenario 2 is going to be where we don't think we're going to sell it, but we do have a non-credit loss portion, and so now we're going to split it between the two. That means that my first journal entry, I'm going to deal with the credit loss portion. And remember, the credit loss, the unworthiness of our client, is going to flow through net income. Just that piece that has to do with the credit loss, that piece will also be credited to the discount on our investment so that it drops the discount to the appropriate value. And the other piece is going to be marked just like we normally would. So here we have the security fair value adjustment. Remember, I told you that those non-credit losses, that's what we've been dealing with all this time up to this point, where it's just the market fluctuations that are causing gains and losses to go on. Well, remember, when you look back at that little timeline that we wrote, the non-credit loss portion only amounted to $106,716 of a loss. And so that's what I want my credit balance to become here, 106,716.63. It's coming from a balance of 96,000. And so therefore, in order to reach that, we're going to have to adjust it by 10,716.63, which will get us up to that balance. But remember, that's the journal entry. That's the unrealized loss that we're going to record for this period. So we have a credit to the security fair value adjustment account, and that is $10,716.63. And we are going to have a unrealized loss just like we normally would to OCI, and that would be for, I'm sorry, I mislabeled it, which it's actually very important to label it correctly. This is an impairment loss, not just an unrealized loss. And that would be for 10,716.63. So remember, of course, that adjustment came from this piece of determining how I'm going to meet the balance here. Right? And that balance is all about the non-credit loss, not the credit loss. The credit loss goes straight to net income. Right? So we'll have another problem to work through in class, because I know there's a lot of moving pieces here. It's going to require some thought, some extreme familiarity with the basics. So this is not for the faint of heart. Got to really know your stuff in order to be able to apply these impairments properly. All right. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in class.